Hello, and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, and I am very happy to be coming at you again for our next installment of this wondrous, amazing, awesome podcast brought to you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and of course here with video on YouTube. This week I have another interview that I have done with a really great guest. I think you guys are really, really going to like him. I got involved in critical thinking shortly after I got out of being involved with Scientology. And critical thinking is something that, I didn't realize or know for most of my life that this was even a topic or a subject. Not having, the big, broad university education and having been, kind of head down in this, cult situation that I was in for so many years. The term critical in Scientology is made into a bad word. If you're critical or if you have critical thinking, that's a bad thing. You avoid it. You don't want to be critical. And so the idea of critical thinking was not something that was on my radar. After I got out of Scientology, started seeing it for what it was and found out how bad it was and that sort of thing, I was casting about, and I've told the story before of how I, didn't know what to think, but I knew that I didn't want to go from one cult to another. Well, I bring this up again only because the guest that I have for the show this week is somebody whose work I actually came across very early on when I was discovering critical thinking. Of course, first I ran into James Randi and Penn and Teller and Carl Sagan, and I read Carl Sagan's book, A Demon-Haunted World, which was just, exactly what I needed to see and read at that time. But my guest, Kevin deLaplante, is somebody whose work I ran across because he was a university professor who was putting together online courses and videos about critical thinking. He was teaching critical thinking online. And I actually did one of his courses and got a great deal out of it. And recently, I've been seeing more of his work on YouTube. He has started a podcast, which is called the Argument Ninja podcast, and he just started this. He's got a lot of videos on YouTube, and the links to his YouTube channel and his podcast are in the comment section of this podcast on sensiblyspeaking.com and on my YouTube channel. But I thought, hey, why don't I reach out to him and see if he wants to talk about this? I mean, I've been positioning myself as a critical thinker, or really what I really am positioning myself as a critical thinker in training. And he is somebody who's teaching it. So why not talk to him? Well, he answered right back, and we arranged to do this podcast, and could not have been happier with the results. In fact, I'm positive that I will be having him on again in the future, because we didn't even get through the half the questions that I had for him. Our conversation went from, of course, talking about him into quite organically rolled into talking about the bigger, broader world and education and critical thinking and that sort of thing. And this is not, I want to stress right now, in case you guys are tuning out or thinking that this is going to be some big boring academic conversation, that this is very much not that. I'm very much a rubber meets the road kind of person. I'm very practical. I'm not into the learned halls of academia just for the sake of academia. I don't like ivory tower thinking. And I like things to be very, very, something you can do something with. And that's what we talked about. And I think you guys are going to like this. Just a little bit of setup before we get going. Kevin was a professor for 17 years at the Iowa State University. He has a degree in physics and a doctorate in philosophy. And he taught critical thinking. He taught physics. He taught high-level ethics and philosophy and whatnot. So he's got a lot of experience with this, and I think that shows in the way he talks about this and some of the things we get into. So here is Kevin deLaplante. So, Kevin, thank you very much for being on my podcast.
It's my pleasure.
Excellent. This is actually really a pleasure for me because I've been following your work for a little while now, and I'm very excited about some of the more recent stuff you've been doing, which we'll talk about in a bit. But first, where are you from? What's your education, your background? How'd you get into this?
Sure. Okay. So I was a philosophy professor at that I worked in academia for almost 20 years. So I was born and raised here in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And I went to school here. I did a physics degree here at Carleton University in Ottawa. And then I went to graduate school in philosophy at the University of Western Ontario.
From physics to philosophy.
Right.
Interesting.
That isn't as strange as you might think. There's a lot of people who do the philosophy of science, for example, who actually often come from a science degree program, and they're just the kind of people who are curious about sort of conceptual issues in the foundations of their field that don't get answered in a regular science class. So if I'm doing a course in relativity theory or quantum mechanics in a physics thing, and I ask about the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, say, in that class, my physics instructors are going to say, that's not what we do here. I mean, we can talk about that, over a beer or something, but that's not what we do here. Right. So I said, oh, that's philosophy. Okay. So the conceptual, so I became very aware of the sort of boundary issues. And I thought, okay, what I'm really interested in is conceptual foundations of the sciences, natural sciences, history of science, and other broader range of issues like the nature of the mind and the brain, the nature of ethics, and so on. So it was clear that I was actually a philosopher at heart. Okay. And I did a bunch of philosophy courses in my undergraduate degree. So when I finished, I was a half a degree. I was a half course shy from getting a second degree in philosophy. So I had a bit of a background when I went to grad school. But I was lucky that the grad program I went to doesn't actually require a philosophy BA to accept philosophy because there was a science emphasis there. They like when science majors come over, and they figure that they can teach them the rest. So I spent 7 years in grad school.
Wow.
And there I was doing history and philosophy of science. I did all the philosophy of physics stuff there. I did a lot of general stuff, ethics, philosophy of mind. My dissertation was on actually conceptual issues in environmental philosophy and its relationship to issues in ecology, the science of ecology. So it was a sort of a weird hybrid project, but that was getting into stuff, my interest in biological sciences, physical science, and the formal sciences like the complex system sciences. And anyways, it was a weird kind of dissertation. But that means when I went on the market for a job, I was applying both for environmental ethics jobs because I could do that, and I was also applying for philosophy of science jobs. And I ended up getting a job in Iowa here at Iowa State. Well, not here now because I've left. But I got a job at Iowa State University in their Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies back in 1999.
Huh.
And I had been there for 16 years. So I was tenured there in 2005. And I was an associate professor there. And I became department chair there back in 2009. So I was doing that for 4 years. And I left that job in 2015. Like I voluntarily left in order to pursue this online, educator business that I'm in now.
Okay.
I started doing videos, however, based on coursework that I was doing as far back as 2005, 2006.
Right. Yeah. Your earliest videos go back many years on your YouTube channel, and it's obvious they have a classroom flavor to them. You even have videos on how to write papers for classes and essays and proper, how to cite references and how to look up, what was plagiarism and things like that.
And they have turned out to be some of the most popular videos because they solve an actual concrete problem that people have. There aren't that many people kids who wake up in the morning and go, I wish I knew the difference between a valid argument and an invalid argument. Like, what's the definition, proper definitions? But they might wake up and think, I'm terrified of the essay that is due next week. I don't know how to do anything, right? So I am actually the stuff on writing. I have found that there's a relationship that critical thinking has been I came to realize that what really interested me about undergraduate teaching was that you're always teaching critical thinking, at least in our courses that we do. Yes, we're doing philosophy and ethics, whatever, but the content is some of it is grounded in sort of critical thinking about sort of deeper questions that are hard to answer by ordinary empirical means, right? So getting your thoughts straight and clear about what the issues are and the history of intellectual debate about a topic like abortion or capital punishment or the nature of knowledge or whatever, you're essentially looking at the history of argumentation, careful argumentation about a particular topic, and you're tracing its history. And you're learning that history, and it involves learning about a sort of dialectic of argumentation that crosses across time, really. Mm-hmm. And you're inserting yourself into that at some point. And I was very interested in what it takes to be capable of inserting yourself into that historical dialogue in a way, say that A, you can understand it, and B, you might have some idea about where you want it to go, like what your contribution might be, right? So, and that means there's a lot of background. You've got to not only understand the content of what's being asserted, but you've got to be able to think clearly, and you've got to be able to express yourself, and you've got to have a command over a certain set of concepts and tools, right? And so we would, we teach these thinking skills and writing skills and communication skills as part of, the overall learning experience. And sometimes we'd have courses where you do like a formal logic class or a critical thinking class where that's the topic about how to, get your thinking right. And so I was teaching critical thinking for a lot of years, just a dedicated critical thinking class as part of the other courses that I was doing. And I came to realize that was kind of the most important thing I was teaching. Because yes, I could be teaching a fourth year course in the philosophy of physics or whatnot, but it's such an esoteric topic of a kind of a luxury interest for people. It's so cool. I love doing it, but it wasn't as foundational as the stuff on core thinking skills.
Right.
And I found that teaching students how to write argumentatively was part and parcel of teaching them how to think clearly. So when you teach someone proper essay format structure, the right way to think about that is to think about what a good argument would look like, right? And how one would respond to the obvious objections to it.
Yeah.
So it's like a formalized, ritualized way of doing argumentation in written form. And I have found so when I do these, when I was doing these tutorials on writing, I always thought of it as of a piece with teaching people how to think. Anyways.
Very much so. Yeah, no, I get the connection. And, I have to say that had I not ended up making a real bad life choice when I was 17 to, drop out of college and pursue Scientology, which I really only got out about 3 or 4 years ago. Had I not made that choice, had I continued on with what I was doing, I wonder how much my education would have paralleled so much of what you're doing, because you and I have actually a lot of common interests between the physics and the philosophy and science of the philosophy of science, the theory of it, how it's built, how it's structured, clear thinking, all that sort of thing. I'm absolutely, if I was going to pursue a university education at this point, I would very much parallel a lot of what you've just been talking about that you've been doing for so many years. How did that, I don't imagine you're the only person who's pursued that line of inquiry and teach in college and that sort of thing, but you are the only one I've seen who's put up online courses, done a YouTube channel on this, really gone out of your way to try to put this into the public sector, you know. And what prompted you to do that, to make that move? And even now, last year, not working at the university anymore. Now this is what you do.
Sure. Well, first off, I agree that there aren't very many of us doing this. That is, academics who've transitioned out, but there are some. For example, there are some philosophers who have YouTube channels with hundreds of videos up there. Greg Sadler, if you want to look up his stuff, but he's mostly history of philosophy and ethics and stuff. So like he's a Hegel scholar, right? And does Aristotle and so on and like this. And so his content is quite different from mine, but he's doing academic entrepreneurship in something like using the same tools that we are, right?
Right.
So I got, I started, the process for me was I started adding videos to my classroom, thinking about the model of a flipped class, where you put some of your lecture materials, the stuff you do over and over again, on a server on your course homepage or whatnot. And then you can point to the students there and say, and then in class, I want you to have watched that video so that when we come back in class on Monday, I want us to talk about the issues. We can have a conversation rather than having to go through over the lecture again. And that was part of the model of flip. So that's the notion of flipping a class, where lectures are put in the cloud somewhere, and then the classroom time is spent doing a lot less lecturing and a lot more conversation and discussion and case studies and things like that. And then when they started to accumulate, and I started to see a path. I see the opportunity. Oh, this could be something that could have its own life online. This is something that could be a resource for the public. Mm-hmm. And my students were the ones who actually told me about this. They said, "This is really valuable. You should put them up on a public site, whatever." And back then, 2006, 2007, 2008, technology is a little bit rougher. Right. The tools are, we live in frankly, it seems like a golden age now WordPress didn't exist back then, right?
That's right.
And on all these tools, and I started off trying to figure out how to do stuff with Flash and I had I didn't know. It was a painful process, right?
Painful is the right word.
Painful process. But once I figured out a kind of workflow that made sense for the time, I started doing stuff. Anyways, and around 2008 or 9, I got the idea we should put them up here, and I had enough videos for a course on fallacies and stuff on basic concepts and logic and argumentation and stuff on some basic propositional logic. And that was like enough to have a core stuff that I would normally be teaching in it as the first half of my critical thinking class, for example. I put that up, and that was the start of a process of that. Eventually, I came to see that people might pay money to get access to it, that they'd be willing to support it. I started a podcast back in 2010, 11. So those videos. Actually, a lot of people who know my stuff know it from the video versions of the podcast, which are now on my site. But originally, they started out as audio podcasts, and I did slides for them as well. So they were video ones, and that's where I did stuff on why critical thinking is important, the value of it, some content on what the essential components of critical thinking are, like what's the skill set look like. That someone has to cultivate or nurture or develop to be able to think critically about some particular topic. I sort of worked that out in the podcast. And then I realized that there were interesting conceptual issues about the nature of critical thinking, about what the skill set looks like, that I realized the stuff I was teaching in my classes was kind of naive. Right. It was critical thinking from the standpoint of someone who's trained in analytic philosophy with a logic background. And the textbooks often that we were using were written from that standpoint. In fact, the critical thinking market in terms of education and college and university courses across Canada and the US at least is dominated by books written by philosophers who have taken it upon themselves to produce critical thinking textbooks that often start out with basic concepts of logic and argumentation. And then they build from there, stuff with fallacies and stuff and so on. And then they do some applications to scientific reasoning or moral reasoning or legal reasoning and so on. They build out the application. But I would then go and have lunch with a colleague who's in the English department, say, and her background is in argumentation from the history of like rhetoric and communications theory, right? And so she's like Aristotle and rhetoric and argumentation and the classic. And it's like there's 2,000 years of writing and research on argumentation that we were never exposed to as philosophers.
Exactly.
Right?
And I know that where this is going, and I want to get into this. But first, I'd like to back up for a second for some of my viewers.
Sure.
And lay out a couple of more fundamental principles first. First off, right, talking about critical thinking, we use this expression, but let's go ahead and define it. Let's just be really basic and start with what is critical thinking?
Well,
it's not generally commonly defined term. A lot of people have some very funny ideas about what critical thinking is.
Well, it's a term. It's like pornography or something. Like you know it when you see it, right? One of those. And there's a whole different way. It's very difficult to arrive at a consensus definition of critical thinking. In some ways, the problem, though, is that what the standard approach often is that you sort of list attributes of what you recognize as good thinking qualities: clear thinking, objectivity, rational, and so forth. But it's a bit like saying, how would you define good parenting, right? And just start listing attributes of good parents. But the thing is that some parents are good in some respects and better in other respects and so forth. You're not going to make much progress thinking you're going to develop a definition of what good parenting is, like a necessary and sufficient set of conditions for a person to be a good parent versus not. It's not like that. It's like trying to define a good athlete, right? It's a rich skill set. It's a collection of attributes. And for me, it's more useful to talk about, well, what are the goals of critical thinking? What are we going for? Like, what's the aim of it all? And so,
yeah, well, you had mentioned, in fact, in one of your earliest videos on this thing, that there were these 4 attributes or 4 goals of critical thinking, and the first one being self-defense, which I liked.
That context there was about 4 or 5 reasons why critical thinking is important.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So there I listed self-defense, logical self-defense to protect yourself from all the various influences, people are trying to influence what you believe, what you value, what your choices are, and so forth.
Yeah.
Then the second one was personal empowerment, which was about once you have a sort of this skill set, we can use it to make our positive case in a way where that is persuasive by thinking clearly about and providing arguments and so on. The third one was civic duty.
Yep.
Civic duty.
Yep.
That when you're a citizen of a liberal democratic culture in the 20th, 21st century, you can be as cynical as you want about whether we live in a democracy or not, really, right? Mm-hmm. But the idea that citizens have that we're entrusted in some sense with judging our leaders, that they owe their allegiance to us. We don't owe our allegiance to them. If you don't buy that, right, then you're not even in the ballpark of democratic citizenship. And then how do you function adequately as a democratic citizen if you're unable to understand the issues, parse the arguments, and so forth?
Right.
So there's something about civic duty there. And then the fourth one was about the role of argumentation and so on in understanding these bigger philosophical issues and being able to understand, be a part of that conversation, and even contribute to it. So those were 4 sort of benefits. But in terms of goals, I now have a two-part definition of what the goals of critical thinking are. The first part has to do with the desire to improve the quality of our beliefs, of our judgments, and our decisions. So quality can mean a number of things, but for example, you want our beliefs to be more likely to be true than false, well justified versus not. Decisions want to be effective and rational and so forth. So improving the quality of all that. So that's a goal. And the other part of it is captured by this idea of the desire to be an independent thinker, to be able to learn how to think for oneself, right? Mm-hmm. To be an independent critical thinker. This is a slogan. I want to teach my kids to think for themselves, right? What does that mean? Well, that's quite different, right? That's different from simply saying their beliefs are more true than false, right? It's right. About, because if you, for example, if you were to give your kid all the true facts, and let's say that they are true, so their beliefs are all true, but they're just parroting what you told them to, like you're their authority. They haven't thought through. They're not a critical thinker in that sense. They could be right. Their judgments could be right, and it could be by a miracle. They just always make the right choices, right? Whatever. But if they don't understand why they're right, or they can't give an account of what their reasoning is, then in some sense there's something important missing. And it's that giving an account part, and giving an account that where you are sort of effectively claiming ownership and responsibility for the beliefs and choices that you have, that you can say with some truth, they're my choices. I'm not just parroting what my parents told me, or my peer group told me, or my church has told me. I have processed this in a way so that I can claim it as my own. Right? So those are virtues, those are issues about intellectual autonomy and ownership and responsibility for our own thoughts and our beliefs. I think that's an important goal of critical thinking. It's importantly different from the goal of simply getting our beliefs right. And that combination of that two-level set of goals, I think, is enough. It's enough to get you talking about what does the skill set look like that actually nurtures and supports those kinds of goals. So that's where I'm coming from, basically.
Perfect. Those are great, and because it really puts a base there as to why is this important. Why this isn't some academic ivory tower thing. This isn't like some critical thinking is not some graduate class you take in philosophy. It's real life. It has to do with living a better life and making the world a better place. And it's that where the rubber meets the road sort of thing that I'm very interested about critical thinking, because it tends to be thought of as sort of academia thing, and it's very much not, not any more than breathing is really, but that's how some people think of it because they don't understand it and they don't understand what uses it has.
Well, the irony for me is that on the one hand, you've got people talking about critical thinking like it's an academic thing. And on the other hand, the buzzword is used everywhere. So every school, every university program, everyone supports critical thinking. That's part of our mission statement in every college, university, and high school, public school, core curriculum values and so on. But they spend so little time talking. So for me, the scandal here is that there's a lot of talk about the importance of these skills, but there's been 2,500 years of history, of intellectual history, by scientists and philosophers working really hard, trying to figure out what it means for human beings to reason well. Mm-hmm. There are disciplines devoted to this. There are fields of science and philosophy and logic and so forth that have done this, and none of this is taught in the public school system at any stage, all the way from kindergarten, and you can go through the PhD in a science and whatever, and for example, you'll never hear any teacher in 13 plus 18 years of schooling give you a definition of a good argument. Right. How is it possible that we get to this point where, and of course, if you go up and ask a teacher, they'll say, if you say, well, why don't you ever teach like what argumentation is? And they say, well, I have no idea what that is because I was never taught that. Right. It's not in the curriculum. It's not part of their background. They don't feel competent teaching it. So it's like something that only philosophers do. It's ridiculous.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. You're totally backing up what I'm talking about here. And it may be somewhat akin to scientific thinking a little bit. Like people assume that there are things that are taught in school, especially people who don't go to school, don't go to university, and they think that these people who have gone to university have this like access to this kind of information of critical thinking and scientific method and rational thought and this sort of thing. And they're just totally off base in assuming that people know anything about this stuff. They're taught, like you mentioned with the physics thing, people might assume that if you're a grad student in physics, you're going to understand and be able to talk intelligently about this whole, alternate universes thing. Whereas the physics teacher is going, dude, that's not what we do here.
Right.
Not talking about that, So I think there's a lot of assumptions made about what goes on in schooling and academia and whatnot that are unrealistic assumptions on this, which is why it's up to people like you and me to popularize and talk about this.
Yeah, well, I think there's an interestingly similar and yet different issue with science because because you do have science as a course. Like there are no critical thinking courses generally in your public school education. I never took a course called critical thinking. I never did a logic course.
Me neither.
There's a couple places like Catholic and Jewish parochial schools that do a little logic in their program or something. But there is science all the way through. Right? Mm-hmm. So there's this explicit recognition of the importance of science education. And yet, when you get people, as someone who's spent his life doing the history and philosophy of science, I went through that program. I had a science education, and I know when I became a graduate student, how little I knew about science. After having done 13 years of, elementary, middle school, secondary, and then a 4-year physics degree, and philosophically interested. It was only when I started learning the history and philosophy of science properly that it sort of thought, well, I knew nothing really. I was so concerned with learning how to solve problems, textbook problems in science, whatever, in physics, and how to apply this or that, theory to that particular thing, that the sort of conceptual framework issues, how different disciplines hang together, how one concept relates to another concept in a different field. And the questions about the implications of science, like, critical thinking about science in like the 21st century were never really discussed. And it gets worse as you go up the path, because in order to become, like a biologist, you start off again in like first year university and some biology, some chemistry, some physics, whatnot. And then as you go your second and third and fourth year up, you drop off all the other sciences. You're just doing biology, right? And you become, when you do the PhD, you're doing extraordinarily narrowly focused science, right? You become an expert in the experimental methodologies and the protocols for answering certain kinds of questions. But you can only do that at the expense of paying almost no attention to what's going on outside the field.
Right.
And so you ask someone who has a PhD in biology to comment on the replication crisis going on in psychology and social science, and they'll say, I guess I've heard that but they have no disciplinary training in it, right? So they're just as informed or uninformed as a layperson is, right?
That's right. That's right.
So,
and they can come off making the same kind of gigantic mistakes that a lay person would make. And yet lay people assume, they've got letters after their name, so they're so much smarter than me, so they're going to know so much more about this stuff. And yet the point you're making, no, it's very focused knowledge and learning, which of course rolls into this next point. I want to bring back up what you were getting into earlier.
Hey there. I just want to take a moment to let you know about a new website that I think you might find useful. I'm sure those of you who are listening to the show right now have been wondering about this mug sitting here that says Got Logic. And those of you who are watching are wondering, where do I get logic? How do you get your fill? Well, fortunately for you, I have the answers. Introducing the Critical Merchandise Web Store, hosted by Spreadshirt.com. If you think that facts matter, that critical thinking is not just for breakfast anymore, and you want to let your friends know that their lack of logic is disturbing, then you need look no further than the Critical Merchandise website. By popular demand, I've put these products together for you guys, and I think you'll find all of them helpful and useful reminders to yourself and to others that sense, logic, and reason are something all of us could use a little bit more of in our lives. Check out Critical Merchandise Store by either using the link below on this channel or by looking on sensiblyspeaking.com at the Critical Merchandise link at the top of the page. 100% of the funds raised from your purchases go back to making this show and my YouTube channel a reality, and I really do appreciate your support. Check out Critical Merchandise today. Your latest podcast, this Argument Ninja podcast you're doing, is really, really good because it points up that, that critical thinking, when it has been taught, even if you can get into the classes and you can get through, understanding critical thinking, logic, rhetoric, and this sort of thing, that it takes a very ivory tower approach and that it's not very real world. In other words, you learn this stuff in an academic environment where everybody understands the rules, everybody's there on the same terms, everybody's like in agreement that they're going to have nice logical arguments, that they're going to make, a proposition, and they're going to, put evidence forward to back up that proposition, and it's either going to work or it's not. Yet you take that kind of thinking to Facebook or down to the local pub, well, forget it. Suddenly, everybody hates you. Everybody's mad at you because you're trying to put forward a logical, a thing, and everybody's like, you don't know what you're talking about, rah, 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 and it's just logical fallacy fest, and it's just a madhouse. And also the other point you make is that the psychology of thinking and how people think is not part of the teaching of formal critical thinking, which blew me away. When I was like, what? How could this be that this is not part of that?
Let's pause for the readers or the listeners to just comment on this because it's really important. So I'm teaching critical thinking out of a course. Let's say I use a book called Critical Thinking. It's a very popular book, and it's got sections on basic concepts in logic and argumentation, some basic stuff on meaning and language, definitions, some stuff on inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning, and so forth, fallacies, and you sort of build it out. Lots of examples and cases. It's very rich. But so in the context of bad reasoning, they often frame it in the language of fallacies, like the fallacy of, ad hominem arguments or slippery slope arguments or so forth. You get used to that, right? But they're defined as sort of failures of good argumentation, and they're not really defined in terms of psychological failures or failures of a description about how people's brains actually work, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas all the cool informative work that's been done on the psychology of human rationality that we've generated since, say, the 1960s, it's led to a revolution in economics and sociology and so forth, behavioral, is about the new empirical study of human reasoning and how different our reasoning is from the algorithmic models that you study, right? So we don't reason in the same way that our normative theories of good reasoning would say we ought to. There are systematic deviations from that. And those deviations are so predictable in general that they can be exploited by people who are familiar with them. And even if you don't have a name for them, if you've been in the sales industry or politics, you've inherited a whole suite of tricks and techniques that are effective at manipulating people or getting people to do what you want or believe what you want, that are effectively exploiting the natural psychology of human beings. And we're just now coming to understand how that psychology works in some detail, how the cognitive science of it all, the neuroscience of it all. this seems like it's fundamentally important, right? If you want to teach people how to think and reason and engage with people so that your message is effective, that you're not going to get, minimize the chances that your message is going to get blocked by a psychological wall, right?
That's right.
And yet we teach none of it. Right. None of it. And in the critical thinking classes I taught for years and years, it only showed up because I started learning on my own and researching the psychological literature and reading these books. Then all of a sudden I struck me, well, this is important, and added material into the critical. So by the time I was finished my teaching career there, about half my course was on the earlier stuff, and about half of it was on psychology of persuasion, belief, and so forth. Students loved it, by the way. They love that combination. And my view is that if you're not teaching that combination now, there's something fundamentally wrong, because you need to have the normative stuff, the stuff that tells you about what good reasoning looks like, ought to look like there. But then you also have to have some account of how people actually reason.
Exactly.
Right. And in order to, and you can't, if you have just the one, right, just a theory of how we ought to reason that pays no attention to how we actually reason, then we're going to make errors over and over and over again. We won't even understand why we're doing them.
That's right.
And if you just learned the psychology about how we're prone to believe, then we have a good descriptive knowledge of how we tend to think, but we don't have a good idea about what better thinking would look like.
Right.
Right? You've got to get them aligned so that the one informs the other.
That's right.
And has a kind of dialogue between them. And that's kind of the motivation for the new podcast and the sort of direction I'm going in with the sort of growing approach to critical thinking education, is to try to get these two bodies of knowledge talking to each other in a way so that you can imagine what would it be like to learn, on the one hand, what good reasoning looks like, and on the other hand, all the various ways in which we systematically can be misled and we're irrational and we're prone to. How does the brain work? What's the right sort of operating manual for our human reasoning so that we can have a chance, right? Yeah. So the analogy with the martial arts is an interesting one for me, because one of the ways that I sort of think of the stuff about persuasion and influence is that it's one of the things that you can do with argumentation and sort of human communication. I can use it to persuade other people. And in fact, there is an argument that the original sort of evolutionary, function of our ability to reason was a social one. It was designed. We have these social groups that we have to persuade our group to. Do we do that, or do we do this, or do we hunt for the bison over there, or do we do this? Do we split up and go this? And so, how do you? So you have to make a case to the group. You could force them to, but offering reasons and then having people be responsive to reasons can be a really adaptive skill set. But then its function then is a kind of social persuasion. It's not essentially, the function isn't essentially to root out the truth and identify falsehoods, right? So, which is not to say that we don't have that ability, but like the core evolutionary feature probably isn't that. It's probably something like a social function. But that's imagining using it for its social persuasion purposes. But then there's also this part about getting it right. We also care about the truth. We also care about objectivity. We also care about getting that our decisions are effective, but they're not just whatever. And so we have co-opted reason as a tool for the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom and truth. Human beings have done that. Science and philosophy, when it's done best, is we have marshaled the resources, these cognitive resources, to this aim, to spectacular effect, right? But those are two very different uses of reason. And I think of it like, the martial artist who learns all these skills that are essentially designed to be a kind of self-defense, be able to defend yourself against attack, be able to assert yourself on offense if you want to, for example. Those are like the persuasion skills. right? The socially mediated persuasion skills. I defend myself from the threats that other people, and I can, and I can launch a counterattack, which is effective, and so on. But if my only goal was just persuasion, that's like the martial artist whose only goal is just to be a better fighter, right? Whereas there are lots of traditional martial arts, say, where the goal of the martial art isn't just to be a better fighter. It's something like, there's a connection to Eastern religious views, for example, and so forth, and mysticism, like integration of mind, body, and spirit, self-realization, non-dual awareness. On the latest podcast I did, I talked about how the philosophy of Taekwondo gives some examples of, it's all about universal peace and harmony. It's all about whatever. It's like, it has nothing to do with fighting.
That's right.
Right. So that's the analogy for me is when reason is directed towards those higher ideals of truth, of knowledge, of wisdom, and not just to win arguments, right? So you have to have both the idea you want reason to be effective and powerful and useful at influencing and persuading. You don't want it to be weak and right. ineffective, but you also want it to be constrained and driven by higher ideals than just winning arguments. So that's where I'm sort of using the martial arts analogy as a sort of conceptual resource for me to think through how these things can interact, because it is a real puzzle. I don't want to undermine how challenging it is, because I have friends that I respect who think that the only kind of human reasoning that's that's valuable, worthwhile, is one that's that's not influenced by any kind of persuasion forces. Like there can't be any unconscious psychological persuasion forces going on, because then you're bypassing your rational cognitive faculty. You're being, for example, if I give you an argument and I use and I know, for example, that if I build a rapport with you beforehand, we talk, I share, we both have kids who are in soccer. That's awesome. That's right. Whatever. And we talk about that for a bit, and we have other sort of history. All of us, it's a classic salesman's shop, right? Where you've gone in, and before we start doing the deal, we do some rapport building, right? And that means that I know that you're going to be more receptive to something I'm going to say if you identify with someone with me. I think I like this person. This person is like me. So whatever they say is probably not going to be threatening, and so on. So the classic persuasion technique, right? What if I did that and then I gave you my argument, and I also am aware that you use certain phrases, the way you articulate a problem, you have a certain way of thinking about it. I'm going to mirror that back to you. I'm going to use that to so that you recognize in my language the issue as you would state it yourself. Yep. And you're going to be nodding your head, and I'm going to nod my head along with you, so you mirror the nodding, right? That's right. All of that. This is classic 101 persuasion. If you went to a Tony Robbins, camp, you would, or you did, a Dale Carnegie course, that's right? How to win friends. This is all stuff, but it can be very effective in all of a sudden making you more receptive to my argument. Right? Now, if I did that, now that's just good social skills. But if I remember giving this example to some friends of mine in philosophy and saying, if I did that intentionally, would I be would you be cool with that? And they'd say, no, it's manipulative. Mm-hmm. No, you're trying to bypass. You're trying to make my reptilian or mammalian brain receptive to your thing, bypassing higher cognitive functioning. And no, I think that there's something wrong with it. So there's this idea that any influence of persuasion like this is a corrupting influence. It's a corrosive influence on pure reason. And there's a conceptual issue here that I'm trying to work through in the podcast and elsewhere about, because I think that's a mistake. I think there is some interesting foundational work that has to be done to figure out an account of reasoning where this isn't the case, because I think it has the unfortunate, impossible result that if the only good reasoning is reasoning that has no trace of psychological unconscious mechanisms informing it, then all of human communication is ruled out.
That's right.
Right.
Well, and I think that's exactly the point I was going to say right from the get-go with that. It's an impossible standard because human beings are human beings and we are emotion driven.
Right.
We're not logically driven. Now, I've come up with a lot of stuff over the last 2 years learning about this stuff that's been very practical for me, but it's been, very practically learned. I don't have a university education. I haven't cracked open, Aristotle and Socrates and whatnot and gone into the formalities of Socratic method and whatnot. I'm kind of aware of that those things exist, but I've been observing a lot for many, many years about persuasion. And now there's books on this stuff and whatnot. But my background, having come from Scientology and then coming out of it, I've seen the results of what we call in the ex-cult world, undue influence. And I think that's what you're touching on right now it's a term that's been used to replace the more loaded term of brainwashing or mind control, right? You mentioned that in your podcast as well. That these are loaded terms, right? Because they have this whole, sort of thing connected to it. And yet we're all subject to various forms of persuasion. And when that persuasion becomes what we call undue influence, in other words, influence you never agreed to. We all agree when we're going onto the used car sales lot that we're going to be sold. We know that's coming. Right? We expect that the salesman is going to come and use some of those techniques on us. But when they're doing things that we didn't agree to, didn't expect, they're lying to us, they're being very blatantly dishonest, but coming across as though they're not, this becomes undue influence. And that's where I think that dividing line can be sort of drawn as to what's okay and what's not okay. And you talking about this subject, I was absolutely fascinated by what you were saying about it.
Well, thanks. I think I haven't seen a whole lot of people talking about it, frankly. There is a kind of there's a subfield in the philosophical literature about, it's the topic of the nature of rational agency, the nature of what it means to be a rational agent. In a sense, and an agent in the sense that I'm the author of my own judgments, and I can say that I have reasons for my judgments, and those reasons are the causes of why I do the things. That sort of conception. And it's very intuitive. It's like part of our folk knowledge of ourselves that we think of ourselves in these terms. But there are a lot of challenges to that folk conception of human nature and behavior that can put some pressure on that sort of naive picture of us. And some people go all the way the other way and say it's an illusion.
That's right.
Like free will is an illusion, like objective moral value is an illusion. The idea of rational agency is a kind of cognitive illusion. It's it's a story that our brains tell ourselves. But the reality is that the causal processes that issue in our behavior and what I speak right now and so forth, those issue from a network of a huge network of causal factors that I have no conscious control over. And a lot of it arises unconsciously in the sense I don't even have, if I try to introspect it, I don't have access to it. I can't I can't access it. It's coming too low below the waterline.
That's right.
And as a result, it puts pressure on the idea that, well, in what sense is it are these my decisions? If even the sense that that my reasoning is itself a product of unconscious psychological processes that I have no control over, and I don't even know how they operate or what's influencing them. So there is a case to be made for a kind of skepticism about this, and this has now become a politically important topic now, because when I'm watching, for example, the debates about Trump and why all of his, why has he been so successful? And Scott Adams is doing the rounds. Have you followed Scott Adams? He's the cartoonist behind Dilbert.
Oh, no, I have not seen anything recently from him, although I love Dilbert.
Well, I love Dilbert too, but Scott's a really iconoclastic thinker, and he's been blogging about Trump for about a year and a half now, I think, and he predicted a landslide victory for Trump a year ago, and Scott is he's a trained hypnotist. He's in his 20s. He took some of these courses that are sort of part of the sort of it was a hypnosis program that I'm learning more about because I'm researching all this stuff in sort of my own work. So he's skilled in the art of what's known as Ericksonian hypnosis, modeled after the hypnotherapist Milton Erickson. And he thinks that all great persuasion ninjas are exploiting this software of the mind. This is the way our brains work. And part of his view is that there is no human rationality. That's an illusion. All of us are always acting according to intuitive judgments and based on emotion and feeling. And all of our reasoning that we think is rational, so on, is actually simply driven by pre-existing emotional commitments, and it's at that level that we're influenced. The engine that drives our behavior and our choices is at this lower level, this emotional level, this identity level, and reasoning is a kind of rationalization process. Right. It comes after the fact. Right. It's not.
The emotions are what makes the decision, and then we justify it with our rationale.
Right. So emotions and things are the engines that drives the choo-choo. Right.
Yep.
It's pulling this thing. And his point is that that's his view. And once you accept that view, everything that's happened in the election makes perfect sense.
He has a very good point.
Well,
I'm not saying that's
right.
100% universal, because I don't fully agree that is the only thing that drives us. But I do believe that he's making some accurate observations about a class of people who follow Trump.
Well, he's making an observation about why Trump has been so successful so far.
Mm-hmm. It's also, and I actually should clarify my remark, because there's also people who follow Hillary for the same reasons, do the same things. Any group of people, you'll find that kind of thinking, but I don't agree that that's the only kind of thinking you would find.
No, well, his has a strong view. He says that it's not just that Trump's supporters are thinking in a uniquely irrational way or an emotional way. We all do. So his diagnosis of the Hillary side, of the liberal left and the conservative right, is on a par.
Yes.
But he's also seems to be like a true cynic about even the possibility of. Right. So I've been listening to the interviews, and he's been going. He says, and he's getting a lot of play right now. He's doing the podcast tour. He's doing the interviews. I've been CNN and Fox News and everything. His profile is huge right now because of the looming. As the election comes closer and closer and closer. Anyways, and he does.
It is a cynical view,
right?
For sure.
His deeper view about rationality, human nature, is deeply skeptical and cynical, and it's something that I'm dealing with, because I agree so much with some of the psychological stuff. Like I agree a lot with when you push it, that we're driven by these. I mean, that's part of understanding the network of persuasion influences. Once you understand that going, it's like where's the room left over for autonomous rational decision making? Mm-hmm. Where's the elbow room left for us to do this? And Scott would say there is none. It's an illusion to think that you have some, and I can't go there, right?
No, because I'll tell you where I draw the line is when you're aware of it. That's when you get freedom of choice. When you're not aware of it, you're absolutely right. And we all have unconscious triggers. We all have buttons, things that can be pushed with us individually that make us act in certain ways. But if you're aware of what those buttons are, or even the fact that exists as a mechanism, you can do something about that. And you can, I believe, have a power of choice over that.
that a person who's not aware of that would not have such a choice. That's my immediate take on that.
That sounds right. That there's the distinction between those who are self-aware about this and those who aren't is going to be a real one.
Yes.
The question of whether that awareness is enough to get you the thing that you seek, that you think you have.
Yes.
It's a bit like the debates about free will, for example, about what is it that I need to establish to be true in order for me to have the freedom of the will that I believe I care about, like the one like genuine, self-authored, autonomous choice.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do I need for that? Well, there's a huge difference between the person who's completely blacked out, right, and unable to make choices for themselves in any conventional sense. I'm clearly freer than they are. But whether I'm free enough to get the conceptual, philosophical thing that I care about, that's where the experts tend to fight about. And I think but I think that there is something, it's not just an academic issue. I think your view about reason in modern society, in the 21st century, if civilization, I'm not really one of these people who's sort of the clash of civilizations types, right? Who thinks that there are threats to the Western way of life that we have to be really be careful of. But I do think that value, placing value on reason and objectivity and like scientific objectivity and reasoning and rational conversation in order to work out issues. That's not a natural human state.
Yes, I agree
right?
with you. Yes.
That's a social achievement.
Yes.
That you have to work at, and it is vulnerable, and it can be fragile, and it can be undone.
Right.
By history and by circumstance and by tragedy and by extreme emotion and by whatnot. We need to be vigilant about the social conditions that would corrode the ability to have rational conversations in public, right? If we can't do that anymore, if we can only do it in the cloistered halls of academia or in scientific research papers or in university classrooms, then we're done. Right? If it's no longer, if we can't speak this way in the public sphere, and that's kind of where I'm concerned that there's so much reporting now about the change, like we've moved into a post-fact political reality, right? Facts don't matter anymore, truth doesn't matter anymore, and public discourse is, we don't jump on people for lying anymore, right? The acceptance of what would be are violations of norms of rational conversation, so that the violations become normalized. It's not even expected anymore. There's something dangerous about that, right?
Very much so. Very much so. In fact, David Nios has said, I think that's how you say his last name, David Nios, has called it the anti-intellectual movement.
Yeah. Well, there's always been a strain of that, especially in the U.S. There's always been part of the U.S. history of rugged individualism. It's pragmatic, individualistic. There's a certain skepticism or cynicism about intellectuals who would come in and claim to know more than the average person does about, what the good life should be. But there was a culture of, think about, if you ever watch old debates with sort of William F. Buckley, the old conservative pundit and author back in the 60s and 70s and 80s when he was where he was, and there's the famous debates between him and who's the author. Anyway, there's a famous series of debates. It's a documentary on Netflix right now. Gore Vidal versus William F. Buckley during the time. And they had this sort of angry sort of, debates around election politics and so forth. But there was this set of rules that they followed, rules of intellectual. They were there was a standard that had to be met, right? It wasn't the standard of the academic classroom, but it was a public standard where if you're a public intellectual arguing about political topics, you had to meet the standard, right? And that's not, it's hard to see that anywhere in the current political climate, at least that's under threat. So I'm interested in the sort of sociology now. I've become more interested in the sociology of the factors that lead people to feel like they have an incentive to follow certain rules of social discourse, rules for, like, when I'm online, I feel a different kind of pressure to write and speak in a certain way than if I'm speaking to you face to face. Like, what's the difference there? What am I worried about if I'm in public versus in private? But if I'm facing the Supreme Court, there's obviously a certain set of rules about the kind of conversation that's normatively acceptable there. And what sets those up? How do we reinforce those? How do we change those? If they're being eroded, what do we do to get them back, right? Those are social science issues. And this is another classic case where, philosophy and logic can be great, but if you don't understand, and it's not just psychology, right? It's psychology, sociology, economics. It's an interdisciplinary set of, factors at play in how we communicate. Right? And I think it's all important, and things all got to be part of sort of a critical investigation about how you would change things. So people ask me, what are your views about education that we could support or improve critical thinking? And I'd say, well, where do you want to start? Because you could talk about what's going on in schools, but if you don't do anything about the broader culture, it's not going to make any difference. It's no different than sending your kid to a taekwondo class, and all they do is forms and katas and so forth, and you think that's going to save them in a street fight.
Right. Exactly.
Like, that'll transfer over. Sorry,
it's a great analogy you're bringing in with the martial arts analogy. It works on so many levels. Yeah, and the multidisciplinary thing is something I've come across again and again. Now, I'm new to this, as far as delving into these various subjects, but I find myself again and again bouncing between psychology, critical thinking, philosophy, sociology more recently, that because there's a thing about groups, which is different from individuals, and how classes of people act versus how individuals act, similarities and differences with those. And I'm thinking to myself that perhaps if we take this and move forward with it, that perhaps the nature of education itself might need to be tweaked a bit if we are going to evolve this, because this is far from the only area where I have found errors or problems, I should say, because of a lack of multidisciplinary education. Psychologists have zero training or psychiatrists even have zero training in neurology, for example. And yet there are neurological conditions that explain a lot about behavior. And psychologists and psychiatrists know nothing about those neurological conditions. They misdiagnose. I've talked to psychologists about this, and they've acknowledged, that's a problem. That's an issue. So this is not the only area.
They have some schooling in these topics, but it amounts to a semester or part of a semester on a topic that then they move on and they don't really have a chance to get a deeper understanding of it, right? And they specialize in an area where those issues aren't germane, like personality theory or cognitive behavioral therapy or stuff like that.
Right, and except that with the advances in neurology, for example, these things are becoming very relevant to psychology and psychiatry, for example. But anyway, I don't mean to digress. I'm just pointing out that this issue is not one that's confined to the topic of critical thinking and psychology and sociology. I believe that there are other issues where we would find similar problems because of that lack of multidisciplinary awareness.
Well, that's where you and I have a big advantage, because we're not inside the academic system. We're not inside a job that forces us to be very narrow. That's all I do all day is sort of jump around between philosophy and logic and psychology or whatever in science. It's like ping pong back and forth. But the great thing is that, we have this sort of canvas in which we can sort of lay out our stuff and put it out there. And And I should say, I mean, it's not hard to get academics, if you get them talking, that agreeing with all this, that the professionalization of academia is like a necessary evil for, they all view it this way, as a certain kind of evil. For quality to be, for great research to be done, you need specialization, right?
For sure.
And interdisciplinary work is very challenging to do. So they wish there was more support for it. They wish there was more. It takes a lot of. I mean, I know, because I used to work in academia where we had lots of discussions about the merits of disciplinary research versus interdisciplinary research, and training students in these things, and how funding goes, and how what gets rewarded by the system versus not rewarded by the system in terms of, publication. So it's easier if you just step outside of all that. Step outside of it and say, there's no one telling me, the irony is that I do way more reading now and writing than I ever did when I was trying to write articles for 10 people to read who will ever read. Right. And in those articles, just trying to make them feel that you're smart. Because that's what a lot of what we did amounts to, is taking a narrow problem and giving a clever solution to it that someone hadn't thought of before. And it's like, that's pretty clever. That's smart. That's good. But unreadable to anyone apart from, 10 or 15 people, maybe.
Exactly. Believe me, I understand. I've been doing a series lately where I've been taking apart academic papers on Scientology. And it's been quite interesting, because probably a total of about 10 people have read these things. And, and there's this whole book on these, and I've been taking them apart essay by essay. And, they're just horrible compared to real world experience on the subject. That I have, and some of their conclusions and whatnot are just completely lame-brained, So it's been interesting for me as a crash course in exactly the things you were just talking about, with the publish or perish philosophy, and the uselessness of some of the work that gets done. Not all of it by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not actually trying to put down academia as a whole, because I believe very strongly that specialization is necessary for that super specialized research you were just referring to. If we don't have that, we lose, and we need that. But I think we also would benefit from just as much, maybe a 50-50 approach of, some people are going to super specialize, but you know what? We're going to have some people go over here and they're going to be multidisciplinary. And they're gonna actually, explore, more of the cross-discipline work that I think could benefit all of us society-wise if we were doing that. I didn't necessarily expect our talk to go in this direction, but this is very interesting. I'm running out of time, and I've still got like 5 things I want to ask you about. So we might have to do this again.
We can schedule something later on. I'm happy to. It's been fun. So I'm happy. I know I probably, my answers sort of filled more chunks.
They were great.
Bigger chunks of time than probably I should have. But
no, I was very, very happy with your answers. Thank you very much. And I think we are definitely going to do this again, because I really, really feel that we have only skimmed the surface of something that obviously means a lot to you, means a lot to me, and I hope we can make it mean a lot to my viewers and the world at large, because this is such an important topic, the ability to think rationally and logically and overcome some of the knee-jerk emotional reactionary stuff that we do in the real world, that all of us do. It's just our way. It's just our native way of responding to things. But if we don't evolve past that, I have real concerns about the long-term, future of our species. And
it's enough maybe just to say that we have. My concern is that the people who are competent and skilled thinkers are going to be part of the elite class, right? They'll be in control of new technology, new science, new applications of things, and there won't and they won't have as much oversight by different, the checks and balances of a more powerful citizenry that has more authority to be able to interrogate and question and influence the direction of those who have their fingers on the knobs. If that gets eroded to the point where people aren't able to formulate a coherent argument against something, so there's no way that they're going to have any influence. People start to assume they're just sheep. You should assume that you get this sort of cynical political realism that favors that pushes us towards anti-democratic systems of doing things, and even more so than maybe it is now. So I think there is something at stake where you have to, I think that in order to keep that drift from going, you've got to do a couple of things at the top structurally, but also you've got to fortify the base. And part of fortifying the base is supporting a culture that values these things, reason, argumentation, so forth. They've got to care about it and recognize its importance. But if we lose that too, then it's hopeless.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's up to us to use what we know about persuasion.
Right.
To sell it.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, you're right, because I swear something that's been going on in the back of my head is like, how, even if I had this great idea for how to restructure critical thinking in education, who am I going to convince? How am I going to convince them? Right?
Right.
If I'm just walking in and think that my giving a clear argument is going to win the day with all these vested interests and powers and so forth, if I don't know how to speak their language and play that game, you're done. Right? So, it's interesting.
Big time. Well, Kevin, again, thank you very much for being on board here. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm sure that I will reach out to you again in the near future.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed that interview with Kevin. If you're looking for some place to get logic, I guess his site would be a place to do that. And like I've mentioned before, he's got online courses and whatnot. And in fact, he sent me a code that I have put in the comments section that you can use if you would like to get access to his courses and classwork at a discount. So you can check that out and use that. And I recommend you do so. And I highly recommend that you check out his YouTube channel at least and see his Argument Ninja podcast, because they're very good. They're also not super long. They're pretty digestible. So enjoy. And if you haven't yet checked out my critical merchandise site, I recommend you do so. And also, I thought it was time I put a plug in. It's been a long time since I've talked about the fact that I wrote a book about Scientology. And and I assume everybody just knows this, but in case you're new to my channel and don't know about this, I did. It's called Scientology A to Xenu, an insider's guide to what Scientology is really all about. And if you're interested in that subject, then this book is definitely for you. You can get it on Amazon, and again, there are links below in the comments section to that. So just thought I'd put a shameless little plug in for that. So thank you very much for coming around. I hope you enjoyed this and got something out of it, and I hope that I will see you guys again next week. Bye-bye.